Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Mining Critical Minerals in Nova Scotia, Clean Energy, Community Impact, and the Just Transition. I'd like to start things off just by acknowledging that this event, although it's virtual, is being hosted in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So this territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725, and these treaties did not deal with the surrender of land, but they did set out the rights and responsibilities that settlers and Mi'kmaq people owe to one another. So as such, we are all treaty people. And before we move on to some introductions, it's important to acknowledge some wage subsidy support from the Clean Foundation, Natural Resources Canada, and the Government of Nova Scotia. And I would also like to extend our sincere gratitude on behalf of the NSCN team to those of you who chose to make a voluntary donation with your registration. Those donations make it a lot easier for NSCN to offer events like tonight's webinar to the public for free, and we're so very grateful for your support. So just a few introductions before we get started. My name is Cass Harris, and I've been working as a coordinator with the Nova Scotia Environmental Network for about 3 years now. Over that time, my role has evolved quite a bit, and it's involved things like coordinating for NSCN's provincial environmental caucuses, organizing events and webinars like this one, supporting NSCN's communications and fundraising efforts, and more. I also want to take a moment to introduce Chris White, who's here with me tonight. Chris is the chair of NSCN's board and is helping support the event this evening as well. So Chris.
Hey everyone, just here to support tonight. Cass runs these by herself a lot of the time, but this is by far the largest audience we've ever had at an NSCN Zoom event, which speaks to how hot this topic is right now. So really excited to get into it. So you may or may not hear from me later, but thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks, Chris. And just a little bit about NSCN before we get started with the presentations. So the Nova Scotia Environmental Network is a network of about 50 environmental organizations now across the province, whose common purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural environment and build a sustainable future for Nova Scotia. So at the network, we strive to support, strengthen, and promote the environmental work of our members by connecting them to each other, to government, and to the public. We do this in several ways, including distributing a monthly newsletter featuring updates from the network and our members, calls to action, opportunities to get involved in the environmental movement across the province, green jobs and volunteer listings, and environmental news. We also facilitate provincial environmental caucuses, like I mentioned a moment ago in my introduction to myself. And we also organize an annual meeting between NSCN members and the Provincial Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Among many other efforts. So if you're interested in learning more about NSCN's work, I invite you to visit our website at nsenvironmentalnetwork.com. And Chris will pop that link into the chat if you want to save it for later. So finally, I'm very happy to welcome 3 incredible guest speakers tonight. We have Jamie Kneen, who is the National Program Co-Lead with MiningWatch Canada. We have Tina Northrup, staff lawyer with East Coast Environmental Law, and Karen McKendry, Senior Wilderness Outreach Coordinator with the Ecology Action Centre. So with that, I will hand it over to our first speaker, which is Karen.
Thank you, Cass, and thank you so much to NSCN for all that you do, because I don't think the environmental movement in Nova Scotia would be the same without you, but also for being willing to host what is a very hot topic right now in Nova Scotia. I also want to say, as a caveat, my background is in conservation biology, and I've been an environmental activist at Ecology Action Centre for 7 years now. So I'm still learning, thanks to the wisdom that's been passed on through the environmental movement and through Ecology Action Centre. A lot of my work in the last couple of years has centered on resistance to gold mining and to engaging with the environmental assessment process. So I've had to learn a lot about uranium in the last couple of months, and I'm trying to transfer the knowledge that I have so far, but I don't have a background in mining and geology. I've just been learning like so many other people on this call. So yes, tonight is about critical minerals, but I am going to delve into uranium to start, not just because it's a very hot topic right now, but because I think it's an instructive topic and insight into larger things that are going on around the recent push for more mining everywhere all at once, including in Nova Scotia. So without going into like a deep history of how uranium came to be in our bedrock, which it is, I'll just go back far enough to share how we got to this point where exploration and mining for uranium is on the table again, and how it's being framed now versus how it was being framed in the past. So some of you on this call would have been involved in this movement in the late 1970s and early 80s, and then again around the year 2009. In the late 1970s, the price of uranium, which goes up and down over time, was at a higher point. Let me see if this sounds familiar. Because it was a higher point in Nova Scotia, there were more people interested in uranium exploration, individual prospectors as well as exploration companies. And they were out on the land exploring for uranium. Landowners were bumping into them, prospectors and companies with or without permission on their land. And individuals and communities were hearing about the potential of exploration companies coming to their communities. People had concerns around risks, risk to health, risk to agricultural soils, the risk of uranium being used in nuclear weapons, and more, both from uranium exploration and from mining. So Nova Scotians began to organize around kitchen tables, as we do. Women's institutes, which are not as common nowadays, but were more common at the time, were some of the original hubs where people were coming together around this. Health professionals were speaking out, and grassroots organizing was happening in Nova Scotia. Organizers networked with each other between different communities and sometimes asked for help from ENGOs like Ecology Action Centre and others. For more on the history of the movement at this time, there was an excellent article recently by Joan Baxter in the Halifax Examiner, and also wonderfully, someone who was involved in the movement wrote a sort of children's story, which is posted online about what was happening at the time. So Cass will share those links in the chat. But again, important to go back and recognize our history and learn from it. And amazingly and terribly, people who were involved in that pushback then are having to come out of the woodwork now and get involved again. So groups and individuals at the time were successful in applying pressure to both municipal leaders and the province, causing it to become a political issue that needed to be responded to. And the provincial government of the day decided to place a moratorium on uranium exploration and mining for the time being, and then hear from Nova Scotians on the topic in a sort of mature conversation way. So in 1981, they created the McLeave Inquiry, which was led by Judge McLeave, which included multiple components, including 44 public meetings in communities so that local voices could be heard and rolled up into a report. Ultimately, in 1985, the McLeave Inquiry was complete and presented to government, and the decision at the time was for the moratorium to stay in place. In 2009, when Premier Darrell Dexter came to power, the moratorium was put into law. But in that time period and since then, the mining branch at Department of Natural Resources has completed multiple reports and advocated that they should reopen exploration for uranium. And the mining lobby has continued to push for the ban to be overturned over the years. So although some Nova Scotians are finding this is a surprising issue, you should know that it is an issue that's been fought multiple times, and there is an undercurrent of pushing for it, at least within government. This wish from within government and from special interest groups like the mining lobby was realized in spring 2025 when the province introduced and passed Bill 6, which is now called an act respecting agriculture, energy, and natural resources. This same act also removed the moratorium on fracking, and this was all done without mature conversations or public input, except for the 100 or so people who went and spoke at Public Bills Committee, which is when a bill is being considered by the MLAs. The premise at the time was that the bans needed to be removed to have a mature conversation, but history shows us we can have a public conversation about something while the ban is still in place. The bans were also removed without consultation with the Mi'kmaq, which the Mi'kmaq chiefs made very clear through a public letter that asserted so. And also this spring, DNR issued a request for proposals for companies who wish to win the right to have the mineral exploration rights in 3 specific areas: East Dalhousie, Millet Brook, and Louisville. And so these communities are rightly concerned and are rising up and are trying to get information about what this means. What's different this time, and we'll talk more about tonight, is the past couple of years, the mining industry and pro-mining parts of government have reframed mining as a vital part of fighting climate change. specifically by providing the minerals needed for clean energy technologies like electric vehicles and wind turbines and nuclear power plants. And they've popularized a new term, critical minerals. So the province of Nova Scotia jumped on this bandwagon as well and created their own critical mineral strategy in 2024 and already updated in 2025 so that it now includes uranium as a critical mineral along with other critical minerals. They also created a new list called strategic minerals, which seem to have nothing to do with critical minerals. They're just a list of things they'd like to mine more of. For the larger context of this conversation around critical minerals, its validity, what it's looking like in Canada, I'm happy to pass things over to Jamie with MiningWatch Canada.
I will unmute myself this time. Thanks. Thanks, Karen. I appreciate that background. And I might I might launch into a bit of a PowerPoint because I laid this out and I'll try and run through it quickly if that's possible. I'm going to fire that up. And I'm hoping that everybody is seeing the slide screen with just critical minerals, critical for what, critical for whom. And as Karen went through, there are, basic criteria that the province set up for what makes a mineral critical, and it starts with the potential for it to exist and be exploited in Nova Scotia. It goes on to talk about the greenhouse gas emissions and the requirement to meet emission reduction targets, net zero by 2050, et cetera, et cetera. That there's some imbalance in supply and demand. So basically supply chain issues or availability issues all wrapped up in that. So is it actually available, and is there a demand for it that is not going to be met that we can help to meet? And then the fourth one kind of opens it up a little bit further by talking about the likelihood of it being a strategic opportunity for Nova Scotia. So something that we can offer the world as a mineral. So hard to say what all of that adds up to until you look at the actual list, but it's maybe not, doesn't look like a bad idea at the surface to say, if we are trying to transition off of fossil fuels and there's a lot of generating and transmission and storage capacity that's needed for renewable energy, that's going to have serious material requirements in terms of the metals that go into making all of these things, whether that's electric vehicles or batteries, storage batteries, transmission lines, wind turbines, solar cells, and so on, actually require quite a lot of material. And we might talk about this later, but there's, some potential, but also some limitations on things like recycling to meet that need. And so, yeah, there is a demand, or at least a projection for a demand for those metals. And then if we go on and look at what's actually happening, we find that what's being mined, if you look into the purposes of what these metals and minerals are going into, not necessarily related to renewable energy. So some of it is just broader industry. Some of it is military use. So bombs, artillery shells, high tech. A lot of the electronics, for instance, are actually much more heavily used by the military than even civilian use. So some of those critical minerals are heavily used by the military. And I'll just say about that is not a sustainable use of resources, perhaps the farthest possible thing from it. If we look at the value chains, the problem with this is that we're talking about basically mining and shipping materials as a raw commodity and then bring them back as finished products because there isn't a lot of refining, processing, or manufacturing going on in Nova Scotia or even in Canada for that matter, even in Quebec and Ontario as the sort of industrial centers of Canada. Those cycles are not internal, so we're still exporting and importing quite a lot. And even if you just focus in on the renewable energy sector, a lot of those materials are just being exported and then shipped back in as photovoltaic cells uh, or wind turbines, and we're not actually building those things. The next one is that they're actually prospective. So if you look at the document that the province has put together, they list all these things and they're all in some level of future potential. So which means that they are years and maybe decades from development. And, by the time that they're actually in our hands and being used for something, things will have changed quite a bit and they may or may not even be relevant at the point, 10 years down the road when they're actually coming to market. And that's not, well, that's portrayed as a failure of, regulation that it takes forever to uh, get a mine permitted. Well, it's actually the fact that it takes forever to get a mine permitted. Well, it doesn't take forever to get a mine permitted, actually. It only takes a few years. It takes forever for the markets to decide that a mine is valuable enough to fund and for the mining companies to put everything together and get all the engineering and everything together to actually build a mine. It's not a trivial task. And it is ultimately the financing that slows these things down. We've got lots of examples of projects that, in the end, the ones that take the longest time to develop or never get developed probably are the most problematic ones, and it's not at all unreasonable. So I will talk about that endlessly. So I'm going to stop there and move on with the the point that this this is not a strategic opportunity. This plan, the province's proposals don't address recycling and the circular economy or moving towards the circular economy. They don't address the processing capacity. They don't really address any of those issues. And so we're still looking at the same extractive economy as the province has been trapped in for centuries. Demand is the elephant in the room in the sense that it's the demand for electricity that is pushing this. And one of the biggest questions really is in terms of whether our strategies are aimed at limiting and reducing demand, at increasing efficiency, at changing the way that energy is used so that it is more efficient and and useful, or are we just looking at replacing existing energy, whether it's for home heating or for transportation or whatever, um, and not doing anything about the overall efficiency so that we just keep increasing our energy use in a context of real world limitations of, freshwater biodiversity damage and so on that are the product of all of this industrial development, but mining in particular. And ultimately, whether this is an exercise in greenwashing or tariff washing. So since the beginning of the year, we've seen a lot of panic around tariffs and the idea that we need to do all of this to address the tariffs, the U.S. tariffs, and build Canadian industry, except that it's basically a business as usual model. And, you know, so what we've seen Premier Houston do is basically double down or triple down on everything that we've been doing for for previous centuries that has created the mess that we're in. And I have to say, doing more of the same thing is unlikely to change the situation. It's unlikely to get us out of the situation that we're in. I'm going to move on to uranium mining in particular, and just to point out that mining is actually a waste management industry. Most of what is mined is left behind. So, in any kind of metal mining, you're talking about maybe a few percent and often a few tenths of a percent of the material, the ore that is mined, is actually the metal that's going to be sold. The rest is left behind as waste, as mill tailings, as waste rock. And in the case of uranium, 85% of the radioactivity in the uranium ore remains in the mill tailings. So when you take the uranium out, you're leaving behind the thorium, the polonium, the radium, all the other radionuclides that are related to uranium, because they're, with minor exceptions for very specialized industry, they're not worth extracting, and generally they're not. So, um, what's left behind is often acid generating as well, often has other heavy metals in it, and the uh, the acid generation. So if you've got sulfides in the rock and the potential for water and air to get at that waste rock or tailings, you end up with acid mine tailings or acid mine drainage, which is, I think, basically the industry's biggest environmental problem, not just for uranium mining, but for all mining, all metal mining, because of this tendency and the potential for toxic contamination. But in the case of uranium mining, the wastes remain radioactive and remain radioactive for thousands and thousands of years based on the half-life of the content. So I think the limiting factor is really thorium, which is, like a quarter of a million years basically in its half-life. And the current techniques for managing that waste have been in use for decades. And the problem with that is that it will be many more decades, if not centuries, before we actually know whether they're safe. And, in a lot of cases, I think, human institutions like banks and governments and regulatory agencies may not be around to look after those things long enough to find out if the containment that we're using now is actually going to work in the long run. The other method of mining uranium, is in situ leach, also called in situ recovery. And so instead of digging open pits or shafts, this is where wells are drilled into the ore body and strong solvents, whether acid or base, are injected into it. And then other wells are drilled around the ore body to collect that solvent with the uranium dissolved in it, which is then extracted from the solution. So it does not produce waste rock or tailings. It doesn't make big open pits and big surface operations, except for the drilling operations. But it does drill through aquifers and aquitards. And so, unless it is very carefully managed, and the evidence has still not been provided that can be done to keep cross-contamination from happening between aquifers, and between aquifers and surface water. So, you're basically dissolving and opening up these uranium ore bodies underground. So we don't know which technique is going to be proposed for potential mining in Nova Scotia, but this solution mining or in situ leach mining has become like the global cheapest and most effective way of getting uranium, and I would say probably the stupidest. That's a technical term for something that is uncontrolled and likely to be very dangerous. Exploration has its own risks, so I'm gonna whip through this to point out that, even at the early stages of mining, it does create a legal interest in the land that violates Indigenous rights and title. Um, sorry, I've got a funny bar in the middle of my screen that I'm trying to get around. Um, we have constitutional protection and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but the existing claim staking and exploration and permitting regimes do violate and override those, as well as property rights and land use and conservation designations. So protected areas, habitat protection, source water protection, that kind of thing, can be overridden by mining permitting because mining is considered to be the quote unquote highest and best use of land. But also the drilling, line cutting, trenching, road building that is associated with mineral exploration also disturbs ecosystems and habitats and can create long-term or permanent damage and change to the landscape. It does have its rewards. So why is, the question is why is the province doing this if the actual mining isn't going to take place for decades? And the answer is one, that it supports investment, and exploration is a highly speculative activity. It's a high risk activity with high rewards. So very few mining projects ever actually, or exploration projects actually ever become mines. One in 10,000 is a common figure from the industry. Um, but if you strike it rich, you strike it rich. You've got a penny stock that's trading for 50 cents or a dollar or $2, suddenly worth tens or even hundreds of dollars. And a project or a company that was worth maybe a few $1 million is suddenly worth, $500 million. So it can be pretty exciting if you're an investor. But the great thing about this is that there are tax incentives that really make it much less risky because you can get flow-through tax benefits and even charitable tax receipts for buying shares and then donating them to charities so that you can, if you're a high net worth individual and you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on mining investments, you can pass this on and you can even just use it as a tax shelter. Meanwhile, the actual exploration activity does provide some economic activity. So it does generate activity in terms of moving machinery, workers, supplies and services, contracting and so on. Not quite as rich as road building, but it does keep the economy going in an area and keeps hotels and restaurants busy and so on, whether or not any mines are ever identified. And the last thing I want to address is whether Nova Scotia actually has the potential to be a player in the global uranium market. And here we're talking about a market that's currently dominated by low-cost production in Kazakhstan. So, almost half of global uranium production is from Kazakhstan, and a good chunk of the rest is also low-cost in situ leach mining elsewhere in the world. The other big, the second biggest production comes from Saskatchewan, which is a totally different approach. These are high grade and high cost mines, so really high technology because they're very dangerous. We're talking about deposits that are up to more than 60% pure uranium and have to be handled with extreme care and a lot of technology. But so Saskatchewan production has actually been shut off at different points in the last 2 years because it's more expensive. So, it's kind of a core for chemical corporation and the Saskatchewan economy, but it's also, like I say, high cost and occasionally, depending on the uranium markets, they don't meet the cost effectiveness and get shut down. And I'm just call it an educated guess, but I think that situation is unlikely to arise in Nova Scotia. And we're talking probably about competing at the low cost end of the market with smaller mines, in situ leach mines, and less expensive processing to produce the uranium concentrate. And of course, the risk that I mentioned before in terms of watersheds and aquifers. I have here a few tables, which I'm not going to go through, but they basically just show this pattern in terms of production, in terms of who actually has more uranium on hand, in terms of where that uranium goes. And the US is the biggest importer. The Russians supply themselves. But just to show that we would still be selling to the States, probably, if not to France and probably not to China. And we can see that in terms of the exports and imports. I'm going to stop there and relinquish the screen, and I'm going to pass it over to Tina to treat us to some of the legal ins and outs of the situation. So thanks very much.
Thanks for that, Jamie. Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Cass, for setting everything up that came before. I'm also going to share my screen, and then I'll say a few words about what I'm going to address tonight. So just take a moment here. Okay, so as Katz mentioned at the beginning, I'm a staff lawyer with the East Coast Environmental Law, and I'm going to say just a few things tonight about some of the regulatory context in Nova Scotia that applies to critical mineral exploration and then on towards the mining stage. What I will address is going to be fairly high level in the time that we have tonight, and I'm going to keep it shorter than I might otherwise under other circumstances, just so that we have a little bit more time in the Q&A for folks to ask questions that are really top of mind for them. I will say that the topics I've chosen to address tonight are based on questions that East Coast Environmental Law has been receiving over the past little while, that the Ecology Action Centre has been receiving, and Karen has been telling me about as we prepared for this webinar. So I know that some of what I've been about to say has been on folks' minds, but I'm sure there are a number of other things that that folks have been beginning to wonder about and be concerned about related to all the movement that we're seeing in Nova Scotia. So although I'll keep the couple of presentation topics here fairly short as I address them, you can, of course, pose questions during this webinar, either by putting them in the chat or during the Q&A period, raising your hand and asking them out loud. And then I also want to mention that East Coast Environmental Law operates a free public environmental law inquiry service. You can find it on our website under the Inquiry Service tab, or using this web address here in the slide. You fill out an inquiry intake form, and then we do our best to respond. The inquiry service is designed mainly to provide general legal information to the public. It's not really designed to provide tailored legal opinion or legal advice or legal representation, but sometimes we can provide some strategic high-level advice about how to navigate relevant environmental law processes, like an environmental assessment or something in that vein. So we judge everything on a case-by-case basis in terms of what we can provide, and if a community's needs or an individual's needs go beyond what we can provide, then we try to help them find another service that may be appropriate. The one final thing I'll say about that is that if you are a member of a community group that has questions that you'd like to put to us through the inquiry service, it's really helpful for us if the community group is organized enough for you to appoint one member to be the point person who writes in on behalf of the group. It sometimes happens that we have multiple members of a community group writing to us, or multiple members of a community that hasn't yet organized, and they don't necessarily know that multiple members of the community are talking to us, and that can be a bit tricky to navigate. So to the extent you can, if you're part of a group that's organizing, great to have a point person to lead those communications. So with that, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about mineral exploration and proposed mining on private property in Nova Scotia under the Mineral Resources Act, which is the act that governs mineral resource exploration and extraction in Nova Scotia. And I'm going to talk about this because I know that there has been quite a lot of questioning happening about private property owners' rights as landowners or land occupiers. And folks have been wondering what exactly their rights are, where do they end, and where do the province's rights and the rights of prospectors or other industry folks begin. So what I'm going to say is that for our purposes tonight, sections 25 and 26 of Nova Scotia's Mineral Resources Act are really important for the exploration stage. Section 25 sets out a legal requirement as a starting point that the consent of a landowner or a land occupier be secured before exploration activities begin on that land. So what this means is that a mineral right holder who has a legal right in hand to explore for minerals, they have to go and get the consent of the land owner or the lawful occupier of that land. For exploration activities that don't involve disturbing the ground, then the consent can be verbal or written. For exploration activities that do involve disturbing the ground, then consent needs to be secured and obtained in writing as a formal requirement. And there's a process that sets all of that out. Now, the difficulty with this and the thing that has many landowners in Nova Scotia concerned is that the Mineral Resources Act also gives the Minister of Natural Resources a power to grant surface access rights to enable exploration when the landowner has refused to give consent. So essentially, there is a mechanism that allows the minister to override the consent of the private landowner and give the person wanting to do exploration the right to access the lands. And that's access that could involve activities that don't disturb the ground and activities that do disturb the ground. So both of those things are possible. This is set out in section 26 of the Act. And then one thing that I think has been on folks' minds is whether there's anything a landowner can do about that if the minister decides to grant surface access and override consent in that way. And the short answer to that question is that the Act makes it very clear that there's no right to appeal a decision by the minister to grant surface access rights to private land. And so what that means then is that the only potential legal recourse available to the landowner or occupier in that context is a judicial review proceeding, which is a proceeding that asks a court to review a decision that's been made by an administrative decision maker like the minister, and in most contexts, decide whether the decision was reasonable under the circumstances and procedurally fair. And I'll just note that reasonableness and procedural fairness in this context are quite complex legal terms. They have a lot that's packaged in within them. And so the situation, if you're considering a judicial review under any circumstance, including this one, it's really a situation where legal advice and legal representation are practically necessities in order to be able to make heads or tails of what's going on. Now, from moving from exploration to actually setting things up to be able to exploit, to engage in mining, another thing that I know has people concerned is the possibility that their land could be expropriated in order to enable mining that landowners do not consent to. So the Mineral Resources Act does allow this. Under Section 27 of the Act, a mineral leaseholder can apply to the Minister of Natural Resources for a vesting order, and that order is essentially an order that will transfer rights or interests in land from the private landowner to the mineral leaseholder in order to enable the mining. When this happens, the Mineral Resources Act is set up to intersect with Nova Scotia's Expropriation Act and its regime. So the vesting order is deemed legally to be an expropriation document, and mechanisms under the Expropriation Act kick in from that point on. I'm not going to go into detail about the Expropriation Act, but if folks have burning questions about it, I may be able to answer them during the Q&A. Now, the other topic I wanted to touch on this evening is environmental impact assessment processes that may be triggered by proposed mining activities. Folks often want to know what kind of assessment is going to happen, how are we going to know if a project is safe, or how are we going to have an opportunity to say to government, this project isn't safe in our view, and here's the research that we have to support it, and here are the concerns our community has, and all the rest. So environmental impact assessments can take a number of different forms. They tend to vary by province and province and between the provinces and the federal level. So Nova Scotia has an environmental assessment process, and proposed projects that trigger environmental assessments in Nova Scotia are listed in a schedule to Nova Scotia's environmental assessment regulations, which were just recently amended, and the amended version is not yet consolidated clearly online in some of the online spaces where you might find them. So just be aware of that. There are a number of mining projects currently listed in the regulations, and they would require what is called in our system here a Class 1 environmental assessment. That's a fairly short process, surprisingly short for many members of the public when they engage in it for the first time. If you are thinking that you may be seeing one of these at some point in the future, I would say be prepared for it to take as little as maybe 2 or 3 months. They typically happen quite quickly. There are opportunities for public review and comment on materials that are filed as part of the environmental assessment, but it can be really difficult for members of the public to review and process all of the information that's provided and then have the time to make comments that feel adequate. And there typically are not better opportunities such as public hearings or other kinds of engagement to allow members of the public to have their say. There sometimes are, but it's typically not the case that those are provided. Notably, uranium mines aren't currently listed in the environmental assessment regulations, although I will say that Nova Scotia's Minister of Environment and Climate Change has a discretionary authority to require environmental assessments of projects, even if they aren't listed. I think that historically, the uranium mines weren't listed because they were banned in Nova Scotia legally, so there wasn't much point in listing them. Now that the possibility has been opened up again, I think it's going to become a matter of some importance to make sure that uranium projects are listed under the regulations. Now, federally, the Government of Canada has a separate process, an impact assessment process, and proposed projects that trigger that process are listed similarly in another list. And this one's set out in federal regulations called the Physical Activities Regulations. Those regulations do list a number of uranium mine projects. And the kind of key threshold for a new mine is that projects that would have production capacities of 2,500 tons per day or more are listed and would trigger the process. Currently, under the current regime, an impact assessment would typically take between 3 to 5 years. And as Jamie was noting, the length of time the process takes really depends on how well prepared the proponent is. So if there's a corporation proposing a mine, the process goes faster if they have relevant information and research and studies and everything done in place. And typically we see delays happen because proponents are just not well prepared. And so the process drags as they do more research that governments need to properly assess the project. When a proposed project triggers both a provincial environmental assessment and a federal impact assessment, the two processes are typically combined into a joint assessment process to create a more streamlined one-stop shop process. And then finally, we see the same kind of intersection with uranium projects in particular and their regulation by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So in Canada, we have this specific body, the CNSC, that has been entrusted with regulatory oversight over uranium mining, milling, and energy generation activities in Canada. So we've got this deliberate kind of regime set up where when a proposed uranium mine triggers a federal impact assessment, the process is going to be designed to act as an integrated assessment and is going to fold in the regulatory responsibilities of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. There's going to be an integrated review panel that has at least one appointee from the Nuclear Safety Commission, and then information generated during the impact assessment informs the licensing decisions that are then made by that body. When proposed uranium mines don't trigger the federal impact assessment process because they're not listed as designated projects, then the Nuclear Safety Commission still conducts an environmental review, and that is carried out through its licensing processes, which are set out under our key kind of nuclear acts in Nova Scotia, the Nuclear Safety and Control Act and its regulations. So that sort of concludes what I plan to say tonight. I think I'll just end by saying, because Nova Scotia has not allowed uranium mining for, or uranium exploration and mining for so long, rather, in my own experience as a lawyer, I've only been practicing for 5 years. So this is very new for me and it's going to be new for many others in the province. If we actually see projects proposed, it will be a new experience to actually work through in a practical way how assessments and various other authorization processes intersect. So this is very much a learning process for me as well. And, a lot will depend on how far any of this goes. So just to say that a lot of this is something that I'm currently learning about. I don't necessarily have all the answers about how all of this will work, but certainly paying a lot of attention and committed to figuring this out as more happens. So I'll end there and turn it back over to Karen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tina and Jamie, for sharing your wisdom, and I hope, and your experience thus far, we're all learning. I hope the questions will be able to draw out even more of what you've learned. Just to tie it back to, the Nova Scotia Critical Mineral Strategy and this current push, There's a lot of language in the strategy and in media releases and in press conferences saying that Nova Scotia's like got to help with Canada's critical mineral supply chain. We need to do this to reach our own provincial greenhouse gas emissions targets and law in 2050. And it's going to create opportunities for Nova Scotians. But then I think the strategy and some of the rhetoric sort of fails to connect the dots between these aspirations and this convenient wording and how it's actually going to be different than just more mining as usual. So again, we can only take some of what government has said and what they've said they've put in their critical mineral strategy. There's almost nothing in there about a circular economy or recycling, both of things that are very pressing to work on if we're serious about addressing the roots of the climate emergency. They also don't commit to using, as Jamie was saying, using the minerals in Nova Scotia for clean energy projects so they could be exported for whatever use. So again, that's sort of failing to connect the dots from the premise of why we need to do this to what we're really going to do. And one of the pillars of the critical mineral strategy, this was brought up by a chief and someone who works for the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative. One of the pillars was working with the Mi'kmaq, and then the Mi'kmaq chiefs had to say very publicly they were not consulted and had no conversations before the bans on uranium mining and fracking were overturned. So I don't sense that relationship is going very well right now. And if that's a central premise of how this is going to be a just transition, this is going to create opportunities for all Nova Scotians, that's really off to a bad start in the last couple of months where this has become very clear. So there's some beautiful framing there, but we either need to see through it or we need to hold government to account for the premises that they're using to set this up. I'll also note a thing that doesn't quite connect is that the critical minerals strategy, when it was updated less than a year after it was made, it created this other list called strategic minerals, which they're not linking to climate change or anything green like that. They said we need to do them for economic purposes. And it includes potash, gypsum, aggregates, and gold. So I would be very wary that these could get money and could be advanced under almost no premise at all. So I think it's valid to push back on those if the framing is really supposed to be about climate change. I will also note that the province was successful in getting federal funding to advance any initiatives under the critical mineral strategy. They got this funding a little bit before the provincial election in the fall, but they didn't talk about it much then. And also the premier took time away from the spring legislative session, which was very short, to travel to Toronto to go to the world's biggest mining conference, which is in Toronto every year, where he made a speech. And he made it very clear, quote, Nova Scotia is open for business and eager to advance critical mineral opportunities, end quote. So he made it sound very much like Nova Scotia is ready to go for full pillaging. And that was, received with a room full of applause. Wonderfully, a Mi'kmaq chief was in the audience and went up sort of unannounced and uninvited and spoke the truth about what Mi'kmaq and people are experiencing in Nova Scotia. So I really encourage you to watch her post as someone who is slicing through all the rhetoric right now. And I think Cass has put her post in the chat. So I think we should really be critical of whether this is the critical minerals framing is what's happening in Nova Scotia or whether this is really Nova Scotia's form of disaster capitalism. And what I mean by that is whether the provincial government and the mining lobby are pulling terms and ideas from emergencies like the climate emergency and the tariffs to justify and advance exploitation that people would have normally balked at under normal circumstances. Because certain parts of DNR and definitely the mining lobby have been wanting to overturn the uranium ban at least and other things for a long time. And now they're really justified and empowered in doing so under the critical minerals framing. So, what other justifications and cuts are they going to make to environmental laws? I believe that Nova Scotians are, once again, seeing through what's really going on here and are having to rise up again. Also, I hope in the Q&A we'll talk more about the environmental assessment process in Nova Scotia. That's something that Tina and I have a lot of experience with, and if exploration moves further, we'll all be going through it some more. We did a piece of work a year or two ago now where we recommended what would make for a better environmental assessment process in Nova Scotia. Many of those recommendations were not adopted by government, but they did make some changes this spring. Yeah, so I welcome now Cass and Chris to lead what will surely be a very interesting Q&A session. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. And thank you very much, Jamie, Karen, and Tina, for your excellent presentations. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our guests did too. So like Karen said, we're now going to move into the Q&A and discussion portion of the event. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So if you have a question, you have a choice. You can ask it by video or you can ask it by typing in the chat. If you are comfortable asking it over video, please raise your hand and we'll call on you when it's your turn. You can find the raise hand function if you're not familiar by clicking on reactions in your toolbar, which should be on the bottom of your screen. It's on the bottom of mine, or it might be on the side. But when you click on that reactions button, you should be able to select raise hand. So like I said, we'll call on you when it's your turn. If you are asking a question by voice on video, please be sure to keep it between 30 and 60 seconds, just to allow time for as much discussion as possible and so we can take as many questions as possible. And if you would prefer to type your question into the chat, please go ahead and we will ask it on your behalf. We do have about 35 minutes for questions tonight, so we'll get through as many of those as we can with the time that we have. If we don't get to yours, don't worry. You're welcome to email it to us after the event, and we'll do our best to get you an answer. Or you could ask it through East Coast Environmental Law's Public Law Inquiry Service. Yeah, so we have a few questions in the chat already. Chris, I don't know if we maybe want to start with one or two of those, and then we can move to some questions by video.
Well, someone's got their hand up if you want to start there.
Sure. Brad, did you want to ask your question first?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of directed at Jamie and the strategic minerals thing. In my mind, strategic minerals were minerals that are like economic or security critical, and that we have an uncertain stability to our supply because of, say, like China's stranglehold on rare earth elements. It's not necessarily a market problem. It's we may not be friends with our supplier in 6 months or whatever term. Is that, there's a number of things I'm touching on here, and I don't have a great grasp on it, so I thought you might have some comments.
Should I respond to that, or should we collect some questions and then have a round of discussion? What's your preference, Cass?
If it's okay with you, I think it might be easier to go one for one.
Sure.
Okay.
So, yes, the funny thing is the federal government had much more sort of explicit criteria saying, talking about that precise scenario that there are supply chain vulnerabilities in terms of either, being able to get what we need or, wanting to do business with the people who have the stuff that we need. And there's a much longer story there too about how China, the Chinese government built this up over decades and building up their industry. And, until very recently, Canada and the US and a lot of other countries were quite happy to let them do that because they could do it at lower cost. Things like rare earth elements are extremely dirty to process. They're very toxic processes and often also radioactive waste is produced. So, we're quite happy for that to happen in Mongolia, not here. But it does create vulnerabilities. The thing is that the feds and I think the province has done the same thing to some extent, kind of then skip over that and add in everything else. So it becomes really hard to discern, what is the policy objective? How is policy being made that actually follows any particular objective? So if that's what we're after, we would focus in on it. If we were really concerned about the energy transition, we would focus in on those aspects. We wouldn't be throwing gold and things into the mix. So that's the problem that we're really faced with in terms of the way the governments have been approaching this whole issue and really muddying the waters in terms of what their policy focus is.
Yeah, just to add to that in the Nova Scotia context, I think the mining lobby has wanted gold to be added to the critical mineral list in the last couple of years, but there hasn't been rationale under the sort of criteria or framing of the critical minerals list. So they made another list and slapped gold on it. Arguably, under the terms that Jamie's describing, like, is there a strategic value because of some constraint or need to go after? There isn't for gold. There's more than enough gold in the world to do anything you want. There's more than enough gold mined already that we don't have to mine it anymore. So there's no world shortage of gold. Is it used for a couple different things? Yes, mostly it's used for like gold bars and bullion and stuff for people to keep in their vaults or whatever. So there's no need to mine more gold. It's not strategic. And our mining experience with gold most recently was the Tuqua gold mine that was open for 6 years. All of that gold went to the Canadian Mint, and all of that profit went to a company in Australia. So I don't know if that was very strategic of us, but we already had an experience with gold recently.
Thanks, Jamie and Karen. We'll take one more by video and then we'll take a couple by chat. So the next person in line is Jeff.
Hi, so I'm actually a geologist, so I have more of a technical question. But I know with a lot of the critical minerals, well, especially lithium, germanium, indium, some of these, there's a lot of different ways that these are mined and a lot of different types of deposits. And I was wondering if anybody knows, like, is Nova Scotia primarily hard rock deposits for this kind of stuff, or brines, or are people talking about like extraction from existing tailings? Just because all of those have quite different impacts and risks or benefits.
So, short answer, hard rock. Um, Different types of deposits. There may be some coal waste in Glace Bay that can be, where rare earths can be extracted or other, trace minerals can be extracted. Um, that might be a tricky, a tricky thing to do. So, yeah, the brine extraction for lithium is basically being looked at in Alberta and California, and that's from underground, and then of course in South America from surface deposits.
Okay, thanks. I work in the Northwest Territories right now, and there's talk about brine extraction for germanium and indium
Hmm.
there as well. So I was just curious.
Interesting. Thanks.
So one question has come up from two different people in the chat. I'm wondering about whether environmental assessments include a human health aspect. Tina or Karen might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first, and then Karen might want to add. The short answer is yes. Human health impacts would typically be assessed both at a provincial environmental assessment here in Nova Scotia and also an impact assessment federally.
Yeah, I would say it depends on the depth and the topics that you're looking for an intersection between, what are the risks of human health and what about the project design or the potential impacts of it. In a previous life, in a different job I worked for Health Canada and human health impact assessment. And so the level of examination that was done under federal human health risk assessments of contaminated sites is not at all the same as the components in a provincial environmental assessment that are looking at some things. I would also say in the environmental assessments I've looked at in the last 7 years, which is probably a couple dozen on quarries and mines and spaceport and all kinds of different things. If they were like assignments in school, I would say a lot of them would get a C. So they don't go in depth on a lot of topics. They skip over some topics. When communities provide feedback and say this environmental assessment totally missed this topic or didn't consider this very accessible research, then that is ignored. So I have seen some very relevant human health questions not get addressed in an EA, and then the minister not ask for additional information on that. So it depends. It depends on the project. It depends on the quality of the information that is put in, and it depends on what the minister is willing to ask for additional information about.
And just tagging on to that one, someone else asked about whether noise and dust are factored into these assessments, which would, I think, play into human health.
Yeah, so again, yes, I mean, obviously depending on the type of project, but any project where noise and dust would be some kind of concern, yes, you would tend to see them addressed. And I agree with Karen's comments. Certainly in the provincial environmental assessment process, we often see proponents doing a kind of slapdash job of addressing some of these issues, um, which then raises other questions about how much opportunity is there to challenge an approval if you really feel that the process has been failing, which is a whole other topic. But yes, if noise and dust are a concern, they should be addressed in a process like this.
I would also say human health impacts like noise and dust come from mines and quarries. We have many quarries in Nova Scotia. What also matters is what happens after the environmental assessment. So I would say more than 99% of environmental assessments are approved in Nova Scotia, and projects are created or expanded, and then they're managed under a number of other permits. There could be conditions with the environmental assessment approval. There can be an industrial approval that has conditions with it, a water withdrawal permit. And so when those things aren't going according to how they're supposed to be, then people can have recourse and try to talk to government about it. But sometimes those things don't get addressed. So I know of communities that have experienced a lot of dust and rocks being kicked up when mining trucks are going by their homes, so that they have to put up wood around their windows. They're having worsened like lung problems because of excessive dust in the air, and that's not being recognized by government. Trucks are speeding, and that's being reported to the RCMP, and that's not being addressed. So there's also the living with the mine that can be different than what was proposed in the environmental assessment.
Thanks, Karen. We'll take a couple from the video people now. So next on the list is Catherine.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kathy Chervin, a member of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. I have a couple of questions, I think, for Tina. There are two new pieces of legislation that were passed this year, giving the government, we think, more access to private property. There was the Bill 1, Part 9, Private Ways Act, and Bill 24, Temporary Access to Adjacent Land Act. Do you know at this point how those bills are going to, or those pieces of legislation are going to perhaps further erode property owners' rights? And my second question is it worth property owners applying for the mineral rights to their own land? I suspect not, because I don't think it would be a very easy process, but thank you for addressing those questions.
Thanks for those questions. So to the first question, I'm not actually familiar with those bills, so that's a great follow-up question. I'd be happy to follow up on that. And the easiest way for me to follow up on that would be, if you felt like it, to submit it as a question through the inquiry service I mentioned. But if not, if you want to pop it in the chat, and also, depending on how comfortable you are popping your email in the chat, you could do that as well, and I'll make a note of it and follow up that way. So whichever you're most comfortable with. For the second question, that one I don't feel really well prepared to answer right now, and for two reasons. One, because I think, but am not 100% sure, and I'd have to go back and double check this, that under the Mineral Resources Act, there's kind of a timeout mechanism where if you have an exploration license and you don't make any use of it, it's not going to last forever. So I think that would be a potential concern in terms of property owners applying for kind of the rights to the minerals under their lands in order to make sure that nothing was ever done with them. But I might pass that question over to Karen because I'm aware that the Ecology Action Centre is putting together a fact sheet for landowners and has some different suggestions and recommendations in it. And she might have some thoughts about that question that she wants to weigh in on as well. And I think Jamie might also have some thoughts where he's been working in this space for a long time. So I'll pass it over to them to see what their perspectives are.
Great. Thank you, Nina.
I'm going to do a bit of a hot potato. So it is true that Ecology Action Centre is working on a landowner rights fact sheet, which will come out soon. Lots of people have asked me that question. Should I get the exploration rights for my own, the claim that goes over my own land and hold them? I haven't run into anyone who's tried that yet. So is like not a geologist, but has gone through the process or has no experience with prospecting or exploration and has tried it. So if anyone on this call has experience with that, I would welcome hearing that because I can't advise it to people as a good way to go until I've heard about some people's experience with it. So maybe Jamie knows other people in Canada who've tried this.
Yeah, it can be done. I mean, that it varies province by province in terms of the specifics. The problem is that it's a registration that has to be renewed, and often it requires some work to be done. I know groups that have tried to stake claims on public land and then do things like trails and boardwalks to make it, you know, to constitute the value of the work that you're supposed to do to keep your claim. And that was in Ontario, and eventually the province decided that that wasn't a mining activity and therefore not valid. So I don't know if, even if it's on your own land, if you could get away with that, let's say you've got a back pasture and you do the work on you do X thousand dollars of work on fencing and so on, and that's not mining related work, and they might just exclude it. So it is, it has been tried. It can be problematic or difficult to keep up, but in the long run, but in the short run, um, it definitely makes a splash. There was a point a number of years ago where one of the First Nations chiefs in BC staked a claim literally in the backyard of the mines minister, just to make a point. To how does it feel? And, obviously she didn't maintain that claim and so on, but she didn't have to because the point had been made. So, as a long-term strategy for preserving your land, it's not really probably sustainable, but it can be fun. Who wants to go next?
Next, we have Casey.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Casey Oliver. I'm a staff lawyer at EcoJustice, and thank you so much for organizing and hosting this webinar. I'm wondering if Jamie and or Karen could talk about what health or environmental impacts, if any, may result just specifically from exploring for uranium, as opposed to mining it. And in the course of your answer, I'm wondering if you're able to touch on the likelihood of those impacts and if there's any resources that you could point folks to refer to.
Okay. So there are sort of general impacts from exploration, so things like noise and disturbance. If it's anywhere close to habitation, then you've got machinery and drills going. You don't want to be within, let's say, a few miles of it because it'll keep you up at night or it'll just, be disturbing. The the bigger issue in terms of the drilling activity and to some extent also with things like trenching is that you can get water pollution, so sedimentation, but also um, if there are heavy metals or uranium being exposed, then that can get into the surface water and groundwater. And the antidote to that is good regulation and good enforcement of those regulations. So where you have specific requirements for where and how drilling operations are set up so that they're protected from potential spills of drilling mud, for instance, or even diesel fuel into the environment. And and the potential contamination there, both for the wildlife and fish, but also for any humans nearby and downstream. So, I mean, to some extent, as long as those things are well regulated, they can be managed. So it's still a disturbance, but if it's again, properly executed and regulated, it's under control. And the long-term damage is more sort of at the ecosystem level rather than specific health impacts. But if it's not well managed, then you get like contaminated drilling mud into surface water and groundwater. Well, drill holes that are not capped properly, for instance, can create a long-term hazard, that kind of thing. So that's sort of the generalities of it. I don't know, Karen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, there are some specific examples in Nova Scotia where regulation enforcement were a problem. So for example, again, most of our recent experiences was the large open pit gold mine on the Eastern Shore. That company went exploring for gold, as long as some other companies, they have exploration permit and it has conditions within it. Like, for example, how close to a lake trees can be cleared so you don't have siltation. So there was a journalist with CBC who found multiple violations of exploration permit conditions, including by the gold mining company. So they were working with heavy machinery and they were not staying within their claim area or cutting too close to a lake. So again, that if that was being enforced and companies were following the rules, then that wouldn't be a problem, but that was a problem more for the environment than for human health. And there are examples in Nova Scotia of when drilling is done to get a sample, if those aren't capped properly, then contaminated water can come up into the landscape and affect surface water. So there was an example of that in the French River watershed by a company that was exploring on private land with the landowner's permission, but then didn't cap the drill hole properly, and it oozed up water and could get into a waterway. That was reported to Nova Scotia Environment and then also to the Department of Natural Resources, and the decision within the department was to do nothing about it. So again, I imagine industry wants to perform well, but they don't always. And then I imagine government wants to enforce, but they don't always. So we don't have a perfect system. So I think that exposes at least the environment to risks. I don't know examples of human health impacts of exploration in Nova Scotia in recent times. There are examples of human health impacts or potential human health impacts from our historic gold mining. And I imagine there are people on this call who would be familiar with some of those.
We did get a question by chat asking where Indigenous rights come into play in all of this. Not sure who might be best suited to start with that question, but I imagine some of you might have things to add.
JB spoke to this a little bit already in his presentation, and so I would just maybe start by echoing what he said, and I think what was also implicit in the way that you introduced this call, Cass, which is that Indigenous rights are kind of fundamental to this issue, and Karen spoke to that at length as well. Mi'kmaq and Nova Scotia have been very concerned about the changes that have been happening quickly without true consultation and engagement and consent. And so I think whenever we're talking about industries that could have a significant impact on land and significant community impacts, significant socioeconomic impacts, there are legal responsibilities and also broader, I would say, moral and ethical responsibilities to be engaging in right relationship as treaty people and as nation to nation partners. So I think that's the broader foundation. I think then the questions about, if the question is more specific about how Indigenous rights intersect with specific pieces of licensing or assessment and all the rest, then that becomes potentially more, like, there are specific technical questions and legal technical questions embedded in all of that. So that's a different kind of answer, but maybe I'll just leave it at that higher level answer and let Jamie and Karen speak to it in the way that they wish.
I'll maybe jump in and just point out that this is something that has been in the courts for about 15 years explicitly and less directly really since the 1980s. Um, the Supreme Court has continually come back and told provinces that and territories that their mineral staking and permitting regimes do not meet the standard of the Canadian Constitution. They have not yet tested the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has a stronger requirement. So the Constitution requires consultation and accommodation of Indigenous inherent and treaty rights, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples requires consent. So not just accommodation, but actually agreement on those conditions. And um, you know, there are cases before the courts in uh, BC, Ontario, and Quebec currently challenging this from a number of First Nations. And I mean, I think the interesting thing is just that the Supreme Court keeps pointing out this failure, and provinces insist on failing to fix it. So it seems to basically be up to every First Nation to go to court to protect its own territory. And they'll eventually get to the Supreme Court and they'll eventually get recognition. They'll eventually force change, but only for that territory. And I think that is, um, you know, a failure of reconciliation, if you will, on the part of both the provinces and the federal government. So, British Columbia may be moving ahead on this because they are actually in the process of rewriting their Mineral Tenure Act um, to meet what they, however they read the UN Declaration. But I think there's some skepticism as to how well that's going to work. And we'll see. But, I think what we should be looking for is engagement from with those rights from the very earliest part of the process. If someone has an interest in doing mining exploration, the first people they talk to are the First Nations. So they work with the Mi'kmaq communities and leadership to decide what areas are open for mining, what areas are to be protected, whether that's for habitat protection or cultural priorities, and move on from there in terms of what kind of conditions that economic activity should be undertaken. So it's not rocket science. It just requires a solid intention.
Thank goodness Tina and Jamie are here because they can speak to Indigenous rights much more than I can. I will say one little sliver of consultation that I've seen in Nova Scotia, because my understanding is there's more than one pathway for it, but there is one of the pathways is between like bureaucratic people in the government of Nova Scotia interacting with the Assembly of Mainland Mi'kmaq and different First Nations about technical aspects of projects that were proposed. And one person who formed that bridge, who worked on that, was I think his role was Director of All New Affairs or Director of Consultation in the Department of All New Affairs within government. And that person was let go and that role was made surplus, as in isn't needed anymore, a couple of months ago. And this was something that was brought up by Mi'kmaq chiefs as not a good sign. The official person that they worked with on some technical projects is gone and has not been replaced because the role isn't needed anymore. So that's not full-on consultation, but that was one pathway that was broken on purpose by the government.
We'll take a question by video next, so I'll call on you, Michael.
Sure. Hi, thanks very much, and good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Parsons. I'm a research scientist with the Geological Survey of Canada, and I've been studying and publishing on the environmental impacts of mineral deposits and mining for the last 25 or 30 years. I wanted to thank you, first of all, for having this discussion. I think these are really, really important questions, and it's great to see the level of engagement here this evening. Like many of you, I share concerns with respect to making sure that we here in the province have the appropriate expertise to evaluate mining proposals, and especially to, it's one thing to have laws in the books, it's another entirely to have the people that have the background and just enough people to make sure that those laws are enforced. And especially the concerns with respect to reconciliation, I think are absolutely fundamental. I think it'll require a culture shift going forward, not just here, but elsewhere across the country to be moving past just engagement, but especially into things like equity partnerships and truly working with Indigenous communities that are interested in development. On the other hand, I did want to just throw this out there, and to whoever on the panel would like to discuss it, what would be your response? I do have a concern that, as Nova Scotians and as a society in general, if we're proposing to build more wind turbines, more solar cells on the top of our houses, we all have mobile phones in our pockets. Arguably, we maybe don't need as many electric cars as industry would like to have us believe. But if one stands in front of one of those giant wind turbines in the Tantramar marshes near Amherst and looks up, that entire structure and the hundreds of them that we are now building in Nova Scotia, it came out of a hole in the ground somewhere on this planet. And so does it not seem somewhat hypocritical that we would not consider mining some of those resources closer to home instead of exporting our environmental and social justice issues overseas into places that have much more lax environmental regulations and that don't have the same degree of concern that I like to think that we do in many parts of this country for regulating our industry. Can we find that balance, and can Nova Scotia, in your opinion, be part of that path forward?
Yeah. JB, Karen, I was thinking I might just jump in, but I don't want to hog the space. I'm sure we all have thoughts about this. And I actually think it'd be great to hear all three of us speak to this from the perspective of our different organizations, because
Sure,
I think our organizations maybe position a little differently on these issues, although in many respects are aligned. So first of all, thank you, Michael, for that question. And preceding the question for your kind comments about the webinar as well. I think it's a really important question, and generally one of the kind of key questions underlying a lot of the discussions that are happening right now in Nova Scotia. And what I can say from my perspective and the perspective of East Coast environmental law is that that we as an organization are mainly about good process. So for us, what's really important is knowing good process and kind of good laws, laws that are designed to ask the right questions and implement the right precautions and safety measures. So our experience as an organization, and Karen has spoken to this a little bit from her perspective, working with the Ecology Action Centre, our experience as an organization has been over many years that there are some significant gaps or flaws, you might say, in the way that, say, environmental assessments happen, in the way that members of the public are able to engage, raise their concerns, feel that their questions are asked. Sometimes members of the public have questions and concerns that can actually be answered easily by industry and government, but they aren't necessarily addressed, or the relationship is so poor because of this track record of low engagement that even if the questions are answered, there's a lack of trust, right? And so I think it's a difficult situation when you have a legal system and assessment and authorization processes that members of the public don't really trust are doing the job. And so I think there is a significant amount of work to be done to build trust by government and by industry that the right questions are being asked and that projects are being, if they're going to be located, they're being located here in good ways, and they're going to be, they're going to be the necessary terms and conditions that are going to protect the public. So I think sometimes, proposed projects, the right answer to them is no, not this project, not here. And then at other times, the answer is, yes, we can do this project here, but here's how we need to impose terms and conditions that allow it to be done safely. So, so that's my take on this. I think that everyone has a duty to consider whether we are exporting environmental harms rather than taking them on ourselves. I think that is an extremely important ethical issue. But I also think that we can't just say, well, let's do it all here and let's get really excited about it without making sure that we have systems in place that are genuinely going to ensure that the work is done well if it happens. That's my personal take.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do better than that, Tina. I mean, we might frame things a little bit differently because we often talk about the true costs of minerals and metals and looking at, the cleanup, the waste that are left behind, the long-term liability, you know, what are the full costs of mining that need to be accounted for in this process? And certainly, they haven't been here. We have abandoned mines littering the landscape that, still need to be cleaned up, that are still costing taxpayers money to clean up. Um, and, it's an awful lot worse in the Congo, where they have that, plus they have rampant human rights abuses and militarization and so on to deal with. So, you know, how you measure those costs and how you account for them, I think is really important. But, you know, we're also, and I think the kind of thing you were talking about is really important in terms of process, that we ensure that we're not just assuming that everything's fine here because we know it's not. And, we have a long way to go before we are able to account for all of those social and environmental liabilities around mining, especially over the long term. And so that is just going to, I think, require a lot of caution in terms of where we go with mining development in particular, but also, and I mentioned this at the outset, looking at how we're using that material and, coming back to the question of its value, are we actually valuing it to its actual cost? So, you know, rather than building rank of after rank of wind turbines, are we looking at, you know, are we actually structuring our transportation systems and our manufacturing and so on to be less wasteful so that we're not, you know, shipping things 3 times across the ocean or 5 times across the ocean before we even use them? And are we creating, appliances that just go into landfills after 10 years when their chip fails? Um, I've had to do that with the stove. It really pissed me off. I've got this $1,000 piece of equipment that I can't use because it's too old and they can't fix it. Um, that shouldn't be happening. And that waste is multiplied on a whole social scale. And so, there are a number of dimensions to it, but I think, it is a really important issue to grapple with. And I appreciate the way you put it up.
Yeah. Thank you for the discussion. Hi, Mike. Good to see
Hey,
you
Kara.
there. Good question that we have also struggled with at Ecology Action Centre, and then so many of us in our personal lives as well. And Tina and Jamie spoke to many of the topics that come up. I would say something that we see at Ecology Action Centre too, and have really struggled with, is some of these clean energy projects, like large wind farms, have impacts on wildlife, which is what I work on. So we've had to struggle internally, where EAC is one of the organizations that has helped get our clean energy targets and more wind turbines on land. And I'm saying, whoa, hang on, the Endangered Species Act is being violated here by the same government that's trying to meet those goals. So there are these really challenging conflicts. I would say one thing, if we're going to take a bit of a justice lens, maybe I'm stretching the word justice, is the person that has always been losing out is Mother Nature. So whether we're advancing mining primarily for economic reasons or mining for working towards a clean energy transition, the loser has always been nature. So maybe it's time to elevate their prominence in the conversation and what's respected about it. And I've seen that in Nova Scotia as well as you have with historic gold mine sites. So maybe thinking more deeply and making more lines in the sand about how much more of our wild nature we're willing to sacrifice in Nova Scotia. I would also say something that doesn't come into the conversation as much in some of the government rhetoric around we have to do more, we have to mine more, is how are we working on efficiency and using less? That's got to be a huge part of the solution, but it doesn't get the same research money. It doesn't get the same support from government. the models are all that we're just going to be using more and more energy. So one thing that Ecology Action Centre did recently is work with a research institute on what are the job possibilities around improving efficiency in Nova Scotia. So how many, literally thousands of jobs could be done are going to be needed in like carpentry and as electricians, including as people age out of those sectors or retire out of those sectors. And how could those be done in a more just way? The parts of the conversation that are underdog and don't always get elevated, those should be elevated by us, by the media, and by government a lot more. I would say also something that we haven't done in Nova Scotia is protect the basics. So we don't manage for watersheds here, even though there's other parts of Canada that have jurisdictions that look at the health of watersheds and manage for those. We're just kind of willy-nilly putting projects where there isn't a project already, but not flipping it on its head and saying, what is healthy and sustainable and resilient about this area? And then could we add a project? We don't ask those fundamental questions. Is this already providing for people and agriculture and the industry already there? So maybe if we're willing to flip and see where the projects could go instead of where the projects would like to go, that would be a different way to do things here to get at some of the resources that we like to get at, but in a less impactful way.
Yeah, thank you
for the good question. It's a challenging one.
Yeah, my colleagues and I spend a lot of time thinking about these questions and have for some years now. And they're really, really important. They don't have easy answers, but I think that conversations like this are a really great place to start. And I look forward to having more of them in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And that does bring us to the end of our time tonight. Apologies to those who asked questions by chat that we didn't get to, but I do invite you to submit your questions in writing if you'd like to info@nsenvironmentalnetwork.com. I'll pop that in the chat, and we'll do our best to follow up with our speakers and get an answer for you. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again to Jamie, Karen, and Tina for joining us tonight and for offering such excellent and informative presentations. And thank you to everyone who attended and participated in the discussion. A recording of the webinar will be emailed to everyone who registered if you'd like to rewatch it later or share it. And we'll be sure to include all of the links that were shared throughout the presentations in that email as well as contact information for each of the organizations that joined us this evening. And the email will also include links to donate or become an NSEN member if you'd like to get more involved or support our work. So yeah, thanks again, everybody. It was really great.
Thank you, Cass. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks to the NSEN for organizing this.